Nothing built by men stands forever, not bridges, not kingdoms, not the peace between hungry suns. This is the world that shaped Rollo and the world my ancestors ruled. He was born into a world already cracking. The kings who ruled the rivers and bridges of Francia, Charles the Bald, Louis the German, Charles the Fat, Robert the Strong, Eudes, and the Simple King, were all men whose blood would one day flow into me. Their failures shaped his childhood, their wars shaped his exile, their collapsing bridges shaped his hunger, and when he stood at the river with Charles the Simple, it was not a stranger he faced, but the distant grandfather of the woman who would one day restore his name. For the world he entered was built by my family, and the world he founded would one day become my inheritance. There was once a boy born into a land where nothing stayed still. The winters pressed hard against the coast, the summers burned the fields thin, and the elders whispered that the land could no longer hold all its sons. He grew up in a valley where the world was already cracking. The kings who ruled the rivers and bridges of Francia, Charles the Bald, Louis the German, Charles the Fat, Robert the Strong, Eudes, and the Simple King, were men locked in quarrels that split kingdoms like rotten wood. Their failures shaped the air he breathed, their wars shaped the hunger in his village, and their collapsing alliances shaped the future he would inherit. He did not know their names then. He only knew the consequences. He learned early that a boy without land was a boy without a future. And when the man who protected his family fell, whether to feud, famine, or the shifting loyalties of kings, the valley turned its back on him, not with cruelty, but with the cold indifference of a world that had no room left for another mouth. So he walked. He walked because staying meant dying. He walked because the sea offered more mercy than the men who ruled the shore. He walked until the name the walker clung to him like a second skin. And as he moved through villages and river towns, he learned the truth that shaped his life. Bridges decide who eats and who starves. Bridges decide who lives and who falls. Bridges decide whether a city holds or breaks. In Paris, the bridges stood against the northern ships. In London, they would one day fall. And the old rhyme that children still sing, "London Bridge is falling down," is only the echo of a lesson he learned as a boy. Nothing built by men is guaranteed to stand, not kingdoms, not treaties, not the fragile peace between hungry sons. He did not become a taker because he wanted gold. He became a taker because every door he knocked on was locked, and every man behind those doors had more than he needed, while the men beside him had nothing at all. This was the world he inherited, a world shaped by kings who were my grandfathers, a world collapsing under the weight of their decisions, a world that forced a landless boy to carve a future from the only thing he had left, his feet, his hunger, and the long road ahead. And from that road, my line began. There comes a moment in a young man's life when the world decides for him. For Rollo, that moment arrived not with ceremony, but with the quiet closing of a door. The elders said the king had changed. Some said he feared the boy's rising strength. Others whispered of a feud, a tribute unpaid, a death that tipped the balance. But the truth was simpler and far colder. There was no longer room for him. The land that had raised him, the same land that had starved him, now turned its back with the indifference of a kingdom collapsing under its own weight. The kings who ruled the rivers and bridges of Francia, Charles the Bald, Louis the German, Charles the Fat, Robert the Strong, Eudes, and the Simple King, were tearing the world apart with their quarrels. Their wars spilled into the north, and the shockwaves reached even the quiet valleys where boys like him tried to grow into men. When his protector fell, the valley did not mourn. It simply shifted its loyalties, as all fragile places do. And the boy who had once belonged suddenly belonged nowhere. Exile was not a sentence, it was a fact. He was given no time to gather his things. No time to argue, no time to plead. He stepped across the boundary of his homeland before he fully understood he had crossed it. And behind him, the door closed, not with anger, but with finality. He walked because he had no choice. He walked because the world behind him had vanished. He walked because the world ahead of him was the only one left. And as he moved through the borderlands, he learned the first rule of exile. A man without land must become a man of the sea, or a man of the sword, or a man of the road. He chose the road, the long road, the hard road, the road that would one day carry him to the gates of Paris, to the banks of the Seine, to the river where my own ancestors, Charles the Simple, Robert the Strong, Hugh the Great, waited for him without knowing they were waiting for family. For exile did not break him. It carved him. It stripped away the boy he had been and left only the man he needed to become. And from that man, my line would one day rise. There is a moment in every exile's life when hunger becomes a teacher, not the hunger of an empty stomach, the deeper hunger, the one that gnaws at a man's place in the world, the hunger for land, for belonging, for a future. Rollo learned that hunger early. He walked through villages where the doors stayed shut, not out of cruelty, but out of fear, fear of famine, fear of kings who taxed them twice in one season. These kings did not know his name, but their quarrels shaped every step he took. He learned that the world was divided into two kinds of men, those who had land and those who had nothing, those behind the doors and those left outside, those who could give and those who were never offered anything at all. And so, the boy who had once walked because he had no choice, now walked with men who had learned the same lesson. Men who had lost their homes to famine, their fathers to war, their futures to the decisions of kings who would one day be my grandfathers. They were not monsters, they were not legends. They were the sons of a collapsing world, and when they reached the river towns, they found the doors still locked, the granaries still guarded, the bridges still held by men who had more than they needed. So they learned to open those doors by force, not for gold, not for glory, but because the world had taught them that nothing would be given. The chronicles call them raiders, but the truth is simpler. They were men who had run out of choices, and Rollo, the walker, the exile, the landless son, became their leader not because he was the strongest, but because he understood the hunger that drove them. He understood that a man without land must take what the world refuses to give. He understood that bridges decide who eats and who starves. He understood that kingdoms fall long before their walls do. And he understood that the kings he would one day face, Charles the Simple, Hugh the Great, Robert the Strong, were the same men whose blood would one day flow into me. For the world he took from was the world my ancestors ruled. There comes a moment when even the strongest men must stop walking. For Rollo, that moment came at a river, a quiet stretch of water that had seen more kings fall than armies cross. The Seine had watched the Carolingians rise, had watched the Robertians fracture, had watched bridges burn and kingdoms split like old timber. And now it watched two men approach from opposite banks. On one side stood the walker, a man carved by exile, hunger, and the long road, a man who had learned to take because the world had never offered him anything else, a man who had led ships up this river until the cities trembled at the sound of oars. On the other side stood a king, my 29th great-grandfather, Charles the Simple, a man born into a crown that weighed more than the realm it ruled. He carried the blood of Louis the German, Charles the Bald, Robert the Strong, Eudes, and the kings who had shaped the world Rollo fled. He carried the burden of their failures, the fractures they left behind, the bridges they could not keep standing. Both men were tired. Both men were cornered by the same collapsing world. Both men needed something the other could give. The chronicles say they negotiated, but the truth is simpler. They recognized each other. One had a crown but no shield. The other had a shield but no home. And in that moment, the river between them became a mirror, showing each man the cost of the life he had lived. Charles spoke first, offering land, legitimacy, and a future, not as a gift, but as a bargain for survival. Rollo listened, not as a conqueror, but as a man who had walked too far to keep walking. And so the two men, the king who could not hold his kingdom, and the exile who had never been given one, struck a pact that would reshape the map of Europe. Rollo bent the knee and Charles lifted him up, not as a subject but as a partner. From that river bank rose Normandy, a land built not from conquest but from necessity, from exhaustion, from the quiet understanding between two men who had run out of other choices. And from that pact continued forward through Hugh the Great, through Hugh Capet, through Vermandois, through Scotland, through Sutherland and Sinclair and Trotter and Hart, until it reached me. For the river where they met was the river that carried my blood. In the end, the land he was given was not a battlefield, not a plundered coast, not a temporary refuge. It was Rouen, a city of stone and river light, a city that had endured kings, sieges, famines, and fire, a city that had watched the Carolingians rise and fall and now opened its gates to a man who had once been turned away from every door. More than 1,000 years have passed since the walker stood at the river and accepted the land that would change his fate. And from Rouen, his line spread outward into France, into Scotland, into the northern highlands, and across the ocean into America. And from that day, Rollo was given something he had never been offered before: a home.